Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the Philly Factor. I'm your host, Paul Perrello. We are joined today by two people responsible for a new book that is out there that really shows us the city of Philadelphia from top to bottom, east to west, in a whole different light. Molly Lester is the author of the book, and Michael Bixler is the photographer of this great book that I have here in my hands. The name of the book is Building Ghosts, Past Lives and Lost Places in a Changing City. And I want to welcome Molly and Mike to the program. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
This book, first of all, it is something like I've never seen before. And my first question is to Michael. And I was going to actually ask you this before we started, but I figured I'd wait till the show because oftentimes when we see books like this, the photos are in black and white. But what brings, besides the stories that have been incorporated into this book, Michael, the color photography is pretty phenomenal. And I have to ask, why color photographs as opposed to black and white photographs that we might otherwise see in a book like this?
I think we decided on color to bring the present to light, to life, to capture all the different nuances within the frame of the photograph. But instead of this book, kind of, it's a perfect, almost a perfect balance between addressing the past and through the photography addressing the future or addressing the present. And so I think it's really important for, a lot of people think of black and white photography as being in the past, even if it was taken yesterday, whereas color is so identifiable that you automatically assume that this is what it looks like, in 2025.
Yeah. I think, Molly, I'm going to ask you why you decided to tackle this subject or tackle this project. But I think it's safe to say that on any given day, no matter where you're traveling, whether it's North Philly, South Philly, West Philly, or the river wards, we have all stumbled upon, intentionally or unintentionally, building ghosts. We've seen them. I didn't know there was an actual term that is associated with these remnants of the past. So my first question then is, what made you decide to take on this project? And then my follow-up question would be to describe building ghosts. What do we mean by building ghosts? So why this project? Let's begin there.
Sure. Well, the starting point for me and why I started conceiving of this project is the kind of encounter that you mentioned, where you stumble on them, they make you curious, they light up something in our brain that says something used to be here, what used to be here. So I had a particular encounter like that back in late 2012, early 2013, where I saw one in Northern Liberties. It fascinated me. It was very raw. All the bricks from the building that had been demolished were on the ground in front of it. And then I went back a couple weeks later to try to see it again, and it was gone, and I couldn't find it, and I had to reorient myself. And it took me a while, but I ultimately realized that there was a construction site and that was one and the same with where I had seen the building ghost. And so I started to pay attention to where I saw them elsewhere in the city and the patterns of how quickly they disappear or how long they remain, and what that says about how a city changes or how particular neighborhoods change. So to me, as an architectural historian, they felt like an entry point for a lot of larger themes about intangible heritage, community history, architectural history, and urban change, all within this vehicle of building ghosts. So when I say building ghosts, we're talking about when two buildings that were built adjacent to each other, most notably row houses, but it's not just row houses, industrial buildings could be built up against each other too. When one of them gets demolished, and you can see on the remaining wall of the surviving building where, for instance, stairs used to be, or the plaster outlines of individual rooms, or where closet shelves were, or some of the more vivid building ghosts also include wallpaper or tile remnants. So we did this project where we were paying attention to building ghosts all over the city and then trying to learn from them about Philadelphia today.
The other thing that I like about the book is that you also include maps in the book that sort of highlight or pinpoint where many of these building ghosts are located. I probably would be most familiar with structures like you had just mentioned, driving, whether it's to campus on LaSalle or in some other part of the city. Those buildings that have fallen down, were demolished, dilapidated, and you would just see on the side of the building where the staircases would be. And it would give you sort of an idea of just the structure that was there. And I'm surprised in many of the pictures that I've seen in the book, and even in some of the buildings that I've passed in driving through the city, is that many of these buildings were 3 stories. It wasn't just the ground floor and the second floor, but there are many where you see 2 staircases, on the side of the wall, which also sheds light on how these homes were constructed, and back in the day. We don't necessarily think of all the work that goes into, a brick structure, whether it's a house or whether it's an apartment building or even a factory. So this really gives us an insight into what these buildings were when they were constructed.
Absolutely. You get the telltale signs of where the joist pockets hook into the brick, where the timber beams would hook into the brick. You get the outline of the roof sometimes. So yeah, it's like looking at the section drawing of that row house, but you're just happening to see remnants instead of an actual drawing. To go back to the maps, which credit to Caitlin Levesque for producing those for the book. They felt as essential to me to include as the vignette histories, as the contemporary essays, and as Michael's photography, because there is such a key factor of geography in terms of where building ghosts do and don't show up. And there are a lot of reasons for why they do and don't show up in certain neighborhoods, but you can't get the sense of that if you are not very grounded in a sense of place for each individual ghost, and for then the collection of 190 that we found in 4 months, 40 of which we feature in depth in the book, and an additional 40 that we feature with photographs in the book. So we needed to have that sense of geography and marry it with the timestamp of when the photographs were taken, when the buildings were constructed and demolished, in order to knit together all the factors that produce a building ghost in the first place.
Michael, with the 190 locations, I have to ask, what came first, the chicken or the egg? What came first, the location or the photography, or did you just happen to be out there snapping pictures and they made? I mean, give me an idea of the process that went into selecting the photos of these properties. I mean, were they pinpointed first and then you went out and took the pictures?
Absolutely. So Neil and I performed a survey over 4 months. We also, we both went out, whether it was walking in a car, driving by on the bus, what have you. We also crowdsourced locations through Molly's Instagram page. And then as we begun officially the survey, we would work off of a list while continuing to add to that list. So it was kind of like, once you feel like you're getting close to the end, there's an extra 40 or 50. And so it was, it kind of generated itself for that 4 months. So yeah, I would go out, shoot as many as I can for the week, and then come regroup with Molly, and then we would consult the list. In the interim, as both of us were still adding to the list ourselves, Molly would do some preliminary research in different locations to see what she could find. And if she did find something that would be a potential candidate for one of her essays, we would kind of focus our priorities on those locations and give those kind of the first shots.
Sure.
Yeah, and some of the ghosts have been around for decades, so they weren't an issue for us both to get to. But sometimes it was whack-a-mole of I would see a ghost and Michael would try to go photograph it a day or two later, and it would already be covered over by new construction. So it was, there's such a turnover factor too for building ghosts.
So 190 are featured in the book, but I suspect there are way more than 190 of these building ghosts throughout the entire Philadelphia area. What made you come up with that magic number of 190 when you could have done 150, or you could have done 200, or you could have even gone more? So why was that number 190 decided upon?
Well, that's not the number we decided upon. That is the number we found in 4 months.
Okay.
80 are within the book, and that we decided on partially because of how much I could find in research about certain ones, which ones were the most compelling photographs for Michael. So there was a little bit of alchemy there that we were figuring out, but we featured them in the book based on the proportions of different neighborhoods. So North Philadelphia is where we found the most. We found several dozen there within those 4 months. So we specifically chose to feature more North Philadelphia ghosts in the book. And then Northwest and Northeast Philadelphia, by contrast, had very few. There's, reasons based on the built environment not really lending itself to building ghosts, because buildings aren't, especially in Northwest, built up against each other, et cetera. So there's these reasons why those neighborhoods don't have many. So there are very few from those neighborhoods in the book, because we wanted that sense of proportionality to come through.
Your essays then that accompany Michael's photography, what do the essays tell us, the reader, then, about these buildings that are included in the book? Because it's one thing, I mean, to go and look at a building ghost and sort of conjure up in your mind who lived here, what was this building. It's 3 stories, so was it just one family in 3 stories, or was it multiple families? So give us an idea of how you work the narrative into the stories that you feature in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the book is structured around 2 different forms of writing. There's site histories, which I called vignettes, for 40 of these ghosts, where I went back into the archive, historic photos, maps, genealogical records, census records, et cetera, to try to reconstruct the history of these 40 ghosts. Who lived there? What lives did they live there? Or what work did they do there? And sometimes I could reconstruct the full arc of the building's existence, and sometimes there was only one particular story that kind of stood out, or was even present in the archival record. So for each of those histories, I was trying to, first of all, humanize these ghosts, that we are trying not to just treat them like pieces of ruin or decay, that these were genuine places of meaning for the people that lived or worked in these places. So I wanted to dignify them with the human stories behind them. That was the overarching goal. And then, with it doesn't even have to be by intention, but you end up getting a sense of Philadelphia's history from a different way in when you are focusing on all these small stories and small, in quotation marks, small lives. So, these aren't big buildings with names or famous architects, or even in most cases, famous residents. And yet we get an entirely rich social history out of them, because, the ones that I was researching in the river wards just happen to have very deep immigrant histories, for instance, where it's layer after layer of Polish residents in the one building, or other ones in West Philadelphia that have these layers of Black residents moving in and out of the house over time. And, other parts of the city also demonstrate the kind of patterns that we know in a macro way, but these individual stories bear that out. And I wasn't even, kind of cherry picking the stories in order to bear that out. It's there for the taking when you go looking for these individual site histories. So that's the intention behind the vignettes. And then the essays, there are 7 essays in the book that are 1 per neighborhood section. And those are trying to think through what ghosts can tell us in a contemporary world. What do the existence of ghosts tell us about how we construct our cities, how we demolish our cities, the interplay between art and building ghosts, et cetera. So each essay has a theme based on the ghosts that we found in that particular neighborhood. And so the vignettes are trying to understand ghosts in a backward-looking sense, and The essays are trying to look at the present day and in a forward-looking sense.
Well, in your research, when you went and visited these sites, do you get into the demise of these buildings? I mean, look, at least once a year, if not more than that. And I don't want to minimize, the oftentimes crumbling infrastructure that we have in big cities like Philadelphia. But do you get into the reason why these buildings dilapidated or fell to the ground, or why they were demolished?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Sometimes it's just an appetite for new construction that is voracious. A lot of the center city ghosts are like that. And by the way, that's borne out by the fact that we time-stamped when the building was demolished and we time-stamped when Michael took his photograph. And sometimes those are, the same moment practically, as opposed to the North Philadelphia ones where a lot of them were demolished decades ago. And here he is photographing them in 2025. So we, yes, that is a kind of broad part of the story for these ghosts, but specifically, I called out every single ghost that was demolished as part of the Department of Licenses and Inspections demolition program, which is a publicly kind of backed program in which if a building is considered imminently dangerous, then L&I can go ahead and authorize its demolition by an outside contractor, try to recoup the costs later, but they're not going to, wait until they get some payment for the demolition. They'll just go ahead and demolish it. And my essay for the North Philadelphia ghosts really critiques that the way we are spending money there. Why are we more willing to, or why have we set up the system so that we can only demolish it rather than intervene earlier with a sense of repair and rehabilitation? So there are, several dozen ghosts throughout the book were created by us, if you want to kind of assign the blame in terms of public agencies, where, as I say in the book, if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so I think we've made this blunt instrument. And so a lot of the ghosts in the book are the result of that blunt instrument.
Michael, in going to these different locations to take these photographs, and the photographs that we see in the book are, I'll say, are pretty clean. The properties are clean, meaning that you're not standing on a pile of bricks or cinder blocks to take the photograph. That the lots there have been cleared. I mean, did you ever find yourself in a position where you were scared or put yourself in danger trying to get the photograph that you needed for the book or wanted for the book?
Not really. I mean, the biggest thing that I was scared of was COVID, because we began our photographic portion of the survey in September, and so there was still tons that we didn't know. As a country, as a world, there was no vaccine. People were still sheltering in place. Schools were still closed. And so to go out into the world, it was a little daunting, both, physically and socially. I wasn't scared at all. If anything, people were very receptive to talk to me because we were also hungry for conversation,
Sure.
more often than not, more hungry for conversation from strangers than our own family that we're locked into houses with. So there was a certain amount of conviviality, I remember seeing a couple in North Philadelphia taking their night walk that had done it. It was at dusk, and I waved to them, and they waved to me and smiled, and it was actually a really kind of beautiful moment, both in putting the book together, but kind of in the city's history. There's one or two instances where folks thought that I was a real estate scout, and that's either easily cleared up or they're just kind of blowing out hot air, and then they pass on and they don't want to hear what you say. But for the most part, people were really interested in what we were doing. But yes, with the bricks and stuff, sometimes there were lots where I almost fell in. Like, there's always always a with any kind of site that is either under under demolition or has been demolished, there's always still stuff that you can hurt yourself on. So there were a few times where I almost twisted my ankle, but about other than that, it was a pretty seamless process.
And I want to mention here too that this was not like your first venture into doing this type of photography, because you are a photographer for Hidden Philadelphia, where oftentimes you're going into places not knowing where you're going or if that next
Right.
step is secure or not. So this was really not. It was. I don't want to minimize your work, but you were sort of familiar with um, digging into places or getting into places. Although all of these places were outside, it had to be a little bit easier than perhaps crawling through a sewer in Southwest Philadelphia looking for whatever it is that you look for.
Yeah, I've been doing this for 10 years. I'm very, very intimately familiar with Philadelphia and all of the dangers. And so this wasn't my first rodeo.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for, first radio. So with only, a, 80 locations in this book, Molly, might there be a second book, or what's next in this world of Building Ghost?
Yeah, we aren't thinking in terms of volume 2 necessarily, partially because the book has done what I hoped it would do, which is start the conversation. So, we don't have to be the only ones carrying it forward. I hope that the whole book is an invitation for everybody who's curious about these, and we're learning along the way that a lot of people are curious about building ghosts. I hope it's an invitation for everybody to stop when they encounter one, to wonder what was there. I think when people ask me what's the overall theme of the book, I think for me, the first and foremost one is I think we are too casual about a sense of disposability of material waste in an era of climate change, disposability of these stories and lives that created these places in the first place. And so I hope that there is some kind of opportunity to not treat these places like blank slates, to investigate what was there, to honor what was there, maybe to be slower about taking down perfectly reasonable buildings the next time around. So when you ask what's next, I hope the conversation continues, but to me, it's not a matter of just like, let's research another 40 more. I think the larger themes that the book hopefully provokes are there to be, wrestled with for any number of other ghosts, even if we don't know the full story behind each individual one.
And that's important, because I guess as a result of this program and as a result of people reading this book, they might want to go out and search for their own building ghost, and then sort of become their own investigators into the history of that building. And not to give away trade secrets here, but how were you able to pinpoint exactly the who, when, where, why, and how of that building? Because, in Philadelphia, and I'm sure in every community, there are those people that have, oh, I remember who lived there, and their uncle who was married to this one whose father gave them the house. You have these long histories of families, but how do you get the true story? I mean, can you give just a general feeling of where you could go and search out the history of some of these buildings?
Sure, I will
Good
give
place
away
to
trade
start.
secrets all day, every day, because it's a fun club to be in.
Yeah.
And Philadelphia is really lucky in terms of a lot of resources that have been digitized. So, a starting point for me was often PhilaGeoHistory, which is an opportunity to look at maps over time. So that was one way I could help to narrow down when a building was built. PhillyHistory.org is also a place where you can look for a lot of photographs. But I will say the research that was hardest to come by for these ghosts was historic photographs, because we're talking about, small row houses on quiet blocks in remote parts of the city, or just quieter parts of the city. And so, if it wasn't Walnut Street in Center City, Philadelphia, it just didn't have as much good coverage for photographs. So that was often the least helpful source for me. Beyond that, the human-centric sources A lot came through Ancestry.com, where I was looking at census records. And as soon as I had names to work from, I could look through genealogical records, and sometimes World War II draft cards are coming up, things like that. So, and historic newspapers were also a source I found a lot in. So I had to piece all the pieces together, and sometimes there were still just gaping question marks, especially when it comes to histories associated with women, histories associated with Black Philadelphians, because both are inadequately covered in the record. So there are definitely times where I still had to make leaps or just acknowledge that the gaps exist and probably won't be cleared up. But that's part of the search is knowing where we can resolve it and where it'll just be an ongoing question mark.
And like Michael had mentioned, like when he was walking through one neighborhood and a couple had just stopped to talk to him, during COVID. I mean, any of those oral histories of people in the neighborhood, did that help or at least start the process of finding out information for some of these places?
Yeah, sometimes it informed it. We did, as Michael mentioned, we crowdsourced ghosts that people were finding, because I have this Instagram account at Building Ghosts that is specifically about this whole project. So sometimes people were sending ghosts, and sometimes when I would repost a photo, like one person messaged and said, "Oh, I used to live around the corner from there. There was a pharmacy in there." So that was definitely part of it. And descendant knowledge is a real thing and very valuable in terms of oral histories. So I don't discount that. But it didn't present itself, unfortunately, for all 40 in a way that would have been wonderful if it had.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank both Molly Lester and Michael Bixler for being with us on this edition of the Philly Factor. Great job with the book. I can't put it down. I keep finding myself just getting sucked in more and more and more and looking at these buildings and these neighborhoods. And I want to thank you for being with us here on this edition of the program.
Thank you. That's so gratifying.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, get out in the neighborhood and search for some of those building ghosts out there. Until the next time, my name is Paul Perrello, and I'll catch you on the next program here on the Philly Factor.